whereby you know the air would actually be passing into the airway. You then have the external respiration, which we just discussed, internal respiration, and then regulation. And we're going to be discussing all of this. Today is really just an introduction to the physiology of respiration, but it does have very important concepts that you have to cover in order to complete the rest of the physiology, especially the regulation. Regulation can get really, really tricky, especially when you're not used to the neuroscience associated with it. Okay, so here we go. Partial pressure. So I want everybody to focus right now and understand where it is that we're going with this physiology. This is where the physiology starts. If it is that you grab these concepts, you must get all of your physiology questions right on the exam. So air, as we know it, has different gases within it, right? And we know the percentages from primary school, prep school days. Oxygen, 21%, standard value. Carbon dioxide used to be 0.03%, but of course, with that increase in factories and economic changes, whatever, we've seen an increase towards that 0.04%. And we all know that nitrogen has that huge percentage of 78%. Why do we want to know this? The concept of partial pressure is very, very important. And partial pressure speaks to the pressure, the unit pressure that each individual gas in a mixture of gases, that in this case being air, has at a constant volume. So, for example, you have a balloon, you blow some air into the balloon, right? Air is not only oxygen, it is not only nitrogen. It has different percentages of gases that are going to exist within that air. And as a result, if it is that we are able to measure each individual gas, then we would realize that even though we have a total pressure being applied to the outwards as relates to the balloon, each individual gas, based on the percentage of the gas within that air, right, within that mixture of gases, would exert a portion of that total pressure, which is why it's called the partial pressure of the total pressure of the gases, right? So barometric atmospheric pressure, you have to know this value, 760 millimeters of mercury, and you can recall the equivalent in pascals. Most of the time, they really just round this value down to 101,000 in most literature, or yeah, in most summer books and literature. But this 760 millimeters of mercury is very important to know. And this 101,000 pascals is important to know, because this is the barometric atmospheric pressure. This is the pressure of air that acts on us at sea level, right? At sea level. Below sea level, atmospheric pressure increases. And that's, if you want to think of, you can think of this in many ways, right? The lower you go, the more air you're going to have acting on you. The higher you go, the less air, right? Because airs have weight. And secondly, you can think of it in the fact that as the lower air exists, the more impurities it will have. So the heavier, quote unquote, heavier it gets. And we know that weight is going to be directly proportional to pressure. And as we said, each gas in the atmosphere will contribute its own pressure, and this is known as its partial pressure. Everybody is okay with this so far? So just send some quick messages, please, so I know I'm not talking to myself. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Anya. All right. So again, this is a bit of a change. Again, I know this was a transition from CAPE. Now, when it is that you were asked at the CAPE level to calculate the partial pressure of oxygen, you see this first line here, this is where you would stop. And you'd feel happy because you get 100%. things not as easy right now, even though they might not ask you this in an exam, but things aren't as easy as this anymore. So if it is that we want to know the partial pressure of oxygen, we can just take the 21% that it holds, right, of this total. So this is the partial pressure percentage of the total pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. And we get this nice value of 160 millimeters of mercury. But as scientists, we know that water exists and oxygen does not exist on its own. Oxygen is going to interact with water, right? So, and when it is that we calculate partial pressure is measured for dry air. So we now are going to have to subtract, right? We're going to have to subtract the partial pressure that water holds, and then we get this value of 713. So really and truly what I'm saying is that if it is that we needed to calculate the percentage of oxygen existing within the lungs, we have to account for the fact that water is going to be contributing to the partial pressure of oxygen. So we have to deduct that value, right? So we know that the partial pressure that water holds is 47. We subtract it from the total value, which is 713, and then we multiply it by this 21%. But if it is that we have to know the percentage of oxygen in the lungs, 21% of oxygen doesn't exist or does not enter into the lungs. Really and truly, outside is where we have 21%. The percentage of oxygen in the air that we inspire is actually 14%. So we take 14%, because this is in the lungs, 14% of 713, because we've removed the influence of water, because we want the partial pressure of dry oxygen. And we then get this value of 99.82. Now, I don't expect you to practice questions like this, but it's really the principle that stands. Understanding that 21% of oxygen is not in the air that you're going to be inspiring. It's going to be 14%. And when it is that we get into the concept of ventilation and perfusion, and how it is that partial pressure influences the transfer of oxygen, gaseous exchange from the capillaries, from the alveoli to the capillaries, we'll know why that value within the alveoli is actually approximately 100. This note that you see right here, everybody gets that, right? Just send messages in the chat again. If you want me to go over it, just say, go over it. Okay, so please note that partial pressures are dependent on temperature, right? And that's going to be largely because if it is that we increase temperature, we increase kinetic energy. And once it is that we increase kinetic energy, we increase the power, the force that each, give me 1 second. We increase the force that each particular molecule will be acting against that closed environment, and therefore temperature will be directly proportional to the pressures. Okay, so the 14%. So in air, you have 21% of oxygen. So that's the percentage, right? Of the partial, so that's the partial pressure that, 14% is 21% is how much oxygen, is a percentage of oxygen within air. The 14% is if it is that we were to take the air within the lungs, it would only have 14% of oxygen. And that's just a difference that stands. That 21% of oxygen is not going to be found within the air, found within your lungs. So we have to account for that. You get that? Why not? That's just, why not again? What do you mean again? The thing is that it's just what it is. Like it's just a loss.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Can I move on? No? Yes? Okay, good. So again, the principle really isn't to remember that it's going to be 14% or 21%. It's just how it is that it boils down to the fact that this is going to be the partial pressure that's going to exist within the alveoli, and the fact that, okay, I'll explain the temperature. So this is is going to be the fact that this is going to be the partial pressure existing within the alveoli, and the difference in this compared to what's going to be in the blood is going to facilitate gaseous exchange, because this pressure is most definitely going to be higher than the partial pressure of oxygen within the blood, which is where it is that it needs to go. Okay, so how is it that partial pressure is affected by temperature? As a rule, an increase in temperature means an increase in pressure. And that's because, remember, gases are made up of molecules. And if it is that you increase temperature, you increase the kinetic energy of these molecules. And in increasing the kinetic energy of these molecules, you're going to have more force. You're going to have more force actually acting outwards against that closed environment. Okay. Yes, that makes sense from cave chemistry, that it's just a matter of some of the molecules passing into the body and by substances and some of them don't. Yeah. So that's what I meant by loss. Like some things are actually just lost on the way. Because again, it's not a perfect system, but at the end of the day, the percentage that exists within the alveoli must be higher than that. Great. Now, the functions of the respiratory system, you'll be familiar with some of these because they're quite obvious, and others you'll meet upon them when it is that you move into the other system courses. So gaseous exchange, quite obviously, right? You may have been introduced to this in other courses, I'm not sure, more than likely in parahistology, where it is that the most common immunoglobulin that actually lines your airway is IgA, right? So the respiratory system has its own protective measure with immunoglobulin A as well as mucus secretion, which traps anything that wants to pass into your lungs. The conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2, we'll cover this more. Yes, thank you, Owen. So that's what's going to exist within the mucus. So once it is that an antigen enters into your airway, you would already have a non-specific, quote-unquote, non-specific antibody to bind to that antigen. And see Owen spitting the facts there. Great. Another function is the conversion of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. So you'll cover this more in cardio. And this function really is going to be with the regulation of blood pressure. So this is very, very important to know. This will follow you right up to your final MB-based exam, that angiotensin 1 is going to be converted to angiotensin 2 within the lungs by ACE, which is angiotensin converting enzyme. And you'll cover that in cardio again. It reduces surface tension via surfactant. The guy should have been exposed to surfactant by now. Surfactant is produced by your alveolar type 2 cells within your alveoli. Surfactant is very important. Without surfactant, you will not live. We will cover surfactant towards the end of this lecture. And yeah, and also it filters air, right? And again, it has the mucus and it has cilia. Yeah, great. So you did cover that. So breathing. Now, before it is that I get into all of the information here, I'm just going to explain it. And I just want you guys to tell me whether or not you understand it. Now, at the beginning, I said that, all right, let's start. Now, in order for your lungs to expand, you're going to need, why is this not closing? Okay, so in order for your lungs to expand and contract during respiration, you're going to need some processes occurring, right? So one of them is going to involve the movement of the diaphragm. The diaphragm is an extremely important muscle. Remember that your diaphragm is going to be innervated by a phrenic nerve. So your diaphragm, in assisting with breathing, you're going to have the downward and upward movement of the diaphragm, which is going to increase the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity. So in this picture, you can see it somewhat, where it is that the diaphragm itself will move up. Here it is that you have the diaphragm. Here it is that you have the diaphragm. In inspiration, you have the diaphragm moving down, and in expiration, you have the diaphragm moving up. Now that is very important. And why is that important? Is really because breathing occurs due to pressure changes and volume changes. Again, make note of that. Breathing occurs due to pressure changes and volume changes. If it is that you don't have pressure changes, or if it is that you have inappropriate pressure changes, you're going to be in problems. Your diaphragm, in contracting and relaxing, facilitates pressure changes. Remember from your CADE physics and your CSEC physics that by increasing volume, you decrease pressure. And by increasing pressure, you reduce volume. That is how breathing works. And I'm going to get into that. So the downward and upward movement of the diaphragm is really what's going to be assisting in the changing the vertical diameter of the thoracic cavity. You also have the involvement of the elevation and depression of your thoracic wall due to the muscles that we have there, right? So remember, you have, for example, your external intercostals, your internal intercostals, and you have some accessory muscles. And those are going to facilitate an increase in the AP diameter of the thoracic cavity. So in pushing your sternum forward or retracting it. So both these processes utilize, as we said before, the inspiratory and expiratory muscles of respiration, including the accessory muscles. Is this okay? Great. So there are several muscles that are going to be indispensable, or that are going to be very important in allowing for inspiration and expiration. And again, you would have covered these muscles in the anatomy labs, if it is that you went. So the muscles that are going to assist with inspiration are going to be external intercostals. So if it is that you remember, the external intercostal muscle is going to start from the rib that is above, and it's going to insert in the rib below, right? And remember that in contraction is from insertion to origin. So when it is that the external intercostal muscles contract, what it is that they're doing is that they're pulling the ribs outwards as if you're lifting buckets. So imagine that your ribs are actually buckets, right? And if it is that you use your arms to pull those buckets up, that's exactly what's happening, right? And what that facilitates in pulling your ribs apart, they facilitate an increase in volume. They facilitate an increase in volume, and that increase in volume is perfect for inspiration, because the point of inspiration is to bring as much air as possible in. If it is that you're not, then that would be a problem. But what is the rule that I told you from before? An increase in volume means that I'm going to be decreasing pressure, because that's a rule. An increase in volume means a decrease in pressure. So atmospheric pressure sits at 760 millimeters of mercury, right? I am going to use my external intercostal muscles to increase the volume and thereby decrease my pressure. And we know that things will move from higher pressures to lower pressures. And therefore, by altering that pressure with the contractions of these muscles, they create pressure differences that are so essential in ensuring that air is going to be moving in one direction, and that would be from the atmosphere and into the lungs. Everyone understands that? Right, great. So Owen was saying that. And that's the principle of Boyle's law. Great. Your diaphragm assists in this as well, right? If it is that your diaphragm is going to be contracting, with it contracting, it creates more space, so it increases volume. And if it is that you increase volume, you decrease pressure. And again, you reduce the pressure below what is outside, and things are then going to flow in. So the principal muscles of inspiration that love to ask these kind of things are going to be your external intercostals and your diaphragm. The diaphragm is the most important muscle. Like the diaphragm is the thing. These here that you see, sternocleidomastoid and the anterior scalene muscles, those are accessory muscles. So those would be more accessed, I guess, or used in really, really deep inspiration. So you'd have the involvement of your neck muscles when it is that you want to take a really, really, really deep breath, like if it is that you're about to run a race or jump into the pool. The expiratory muscles include the internal intercostal muscles. They insert opposite the external intercostal muscles, meaning their responsibility is to depress the rib cage. In depressing the rib cage, you depress, you reduce the pressure, and you increase the the pressure. And if it is that you increase the pressure, air is not going to want to flow in. The abdominal muscles are going to be accessed more. Right, great. Thank you. Yeah, so your abdominal muscles are going to be accessed more in forced expiration. So for example, when it is that you're doing abs, without you even thinking, the abdominal muscles are actually pushing your rib cage more together, pushing up your diaphragm, so your diaphragm can't really contract. And that in and of itself, that reduction in volume there actually increases the pressure above that of what's outside. Everybody gets that? Great. So I've basically told you everything, right? So the pressure changes for air movement. So in order for respiration to occur, there must be a pressure gradient, as I said before. There must, yeah, so to accommodate net air movement in and out of the respiratory system. So I'm going to get more specifically into what pressures exist. So again, for the persons who probably never got it the first time, I brought up the muscles of the thoracic wall as well as the diaphragm to explain to you how Boyle's law works. If it is that I have muscles, for example, my external intercostals and my diaphragm, contracting and resulting in an increase in thoracic volume, I'm going to have a decrease in pressure. That pressure is going to be far below what is going to be outside, and things are then therefore going to flow on the inside. Why? But yeah, you get what I'm saying. On the opposite side, your internal intercostals, your abdominal muscles, your innermost intercostals are going to be responsible for depressing your rib cage and reducing volume. And that increases pressure and gets air outside. Now let's talk specifically about the pressures that exist. So you have intrapleural pressure. That would be the pressure that I spoke about existed between your parietal pleura and your visceral pleura. Again, your visceral pleura is against your lungs. Your viscera means organs. Your parietal pleura is against your body wall. And in between, as I said before, you have pleural fluid, about 25 milliliters. Very, very important. You shouldn't have the overproduction of pleural fluid or the underproduction. Intrapulmonary pressure is going to be the pressure within your alveoli. And then you have transpulmonary pressure, which is really the difference in pressure between the alveoli and the outside. Everybody gets that. So this is in the pleural space, in the alveoli, and the difference between inside and outside. Which part, Lawrence? Like always? Okay, I'll just go. So we spoke about how it is that pressure and volume changes and facilitates breathing. Now, what it is that we want to get into specifically are what pressures change. And you have the existence of three major pressures. You have the existence of intrapleural pressure, intrapulmonary pressure, and transpulmonary pressure. Intrapleural pressure within the pleural space, intrapulmonary within your alveoli, and transpulmonary is going to be the difference between inside and outside. Now, these values that you see here, you need to remember them, but you need to remember the principle behind it. So, as a fact, and you should know this, and you should write this down if it is that you're writing, intrapleural pressure is always negative. It is always negative. Now, I told you that the atmospheric pressure, remember I brought it up, where was that? It was at 101,000 pascals, right? That's it. And that pressure, atmospheric pressure, is equal to intrapulmonary pressure at all times. Not at all times, at rest, right? At rest, atmospheric pressure will be equal to intrapulmonary pressure. And that makes sense. So I'm talking about when it is that nothing is going on, it is going to be equal. So at that point, there will be obviously no air entering into your alveoli or leaving your alveoli, right? So really and truly what these values are showing are ranges or the changes in pressure as breathing occurs. You see this value right here of 0 millimeters of mercury, this is the relative pressure. I need to get back to that slide. All right, never mind. So the intrapulmonary pressure is at rest is going to be equal to the atmospheric pressure. And again, this value is relative to the 101,000 pascals. So really and truly, if it is that I had said this value is 101,000 pascals or 0 pascals, it will be the same thing because everything is going to be relative to the atmospheric pressure. As we said, intrapleural pressure is always negative, and the standard value for it is about -4, meaning at rest, that value will be -4. You can either decrease that pressure to -2.5, or you can increase, you can either decrease it to -6, or you can increase it to -2.5. The transpulmonary pressure, as I explained before, is only going to be the difference between pleural and pulmonary pressure. As we said, at rest, intrapulmonary pressure is equal to the atmospheric pressure. And we're going to explain why now that the intrapleural pressure is negative at rest. Now, irregardless of whatever it is that these values are at rest, the point still stands that a decrease in these pressures are going to facilitate air moving in, and then the increase in the pressure is going to facilitate air moving out. Everybody understand that? Send a yes quickly, please. Okay, great. Okay, so I mean, sorry by the way, guys, the PowerPoint is moving weird. But anyways, so as it stands, right, you have an atmospheric pressure of 101,000 pascals, right, at sea level. Intrapulmonary pressure is equal to that value at rest, because we'd expect that the pressure within the alveoli, if air is not moving in nor out, would have to be equal. Intrapleural pressure for cases that I'm going to explain now, or for reasons that I'm going to explain now, is going to be reduced to at rest being -4. But again, regardless of intrapulmonary pressure being at rest 0 or -4, it doesn't matter, because all that what facilitates breathing is a reduction in the pressure and an increase in the pressure. That's what gets air flowing. So what are the causes? There are two causes that explains the negativity of the intrapleural pressure, and I want you guys to work with me. The simpler one is just the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system has to be in place to drain pleural fluid, right? Because again, I said you can't have an overproduction of pleural fluid, as you'd expect. If it is that you have an overproduction of pleural fluid, you can have a buildup of fluid around the lungs. And a buildup of fluid around the lungs is not good, because that would decrease the ability of the lungs to be able to expand. And therefore, that would actually give issues with breathing. Pleural effusion, yeah, pretty much. Well, pleural effusion, sure, yeah. So the lymphatic system is going to be very important in striking that balance. And you cover this in cell bio with Dr. Bowers, right? Where it is that you have that almost equal drainage and production somewhat to ensure that you have just that 25 milliliters of pleural fluid at any point in time. And the lymphatic system literally draining or sucking away the pleural fluid generates a negative intrapleural pressure, right? Now, the big reason that people tend to get confused with is this point right here. So again, I bring to your attention that you have visceral pleura and you have parietal pleura. And I want you guys to understand this. You have visceral pleura and you have parietal pleura. So take this line right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Tell me, like this one on the right-hand side to be my visceral pleura, and over here to be my parietal pleura. Everybody can get that? Or let me see if I can find a diagram. Yeah, the PowerPoint is not moving. Okay, great. So what's going to happen is that on this side, you have my lungs, right? And on this side, you're going to have my parietal pleura plastered against my body wall. Now, your lungs, as it stands, are elastic. And we're going to speak about elasticity. A lot of you guys think elasticity is about stretch. Elasticity is not about stretch. Put an asterisk, 500 asterisks beside the word elasticity in a notebook. Elasticity is a measure of recoil. It is not a measure of stretch. Again, elasticity is a measure of recoil. There is another term for the measure of stretch. The elasticity of the lungs causes them to want to assume the smallest possible position. Now, if it is that I have visceral pleura against my lungs and I have a net force where it is that my lungs wants to collapse, like literally collapse, it is going to be pulling away that visceral pleura away from my parietal pleura, which is on this side. And if it is that you're a smart medical student, you would remember that if it is that I have this being pulled away from this, I have an increase in volume right here. And once you've increased volume, you've done what? Decreased pressure. And that is one of the major reasons for that, that negative pressure existing within that pleural space, where it is that because of the natural elasticity of the lungs, where it is that the lungs want to collapse, and the elasticity of the chest wall, where it is that the chest wall wants to pull itself away from the lungs, you have a net kind of increase or this kind of tension building up here, right? Where it is that you have this volume here that facilitates that decrease in pressure. Everybody understands that? So yes, no, maybe so. Go over it again. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I thought about that for hours. So the intrapulmonary pressure and so the pressure relationship, so intrapulmonary pressure and intrapleural pressure fluctuate with the phases of breathing, right? I will understand that because that's the only way breathing can occur. Pressure differences / volume differences. Intrapulmonary pressure always eventually equalizes itself with atmospheric pressure, because at some point, even if it's just milliseconds, you're not breathing in or out. And intrapleural pressure is always less than intrapulmonary pressure and atmospheric pressure. Now, yeah. Next slide, please. This value is quoted here is -2. This is per just the influence that the lymphatic system has. So this is per a corresponding -2 as well. Great. So graphs, we love graphs. So as I've explained, right, this is intraalveolar pressure, right? We know that when it is that we're neither breathing in nor out, it's going to stand at 0, right? 0 millimeters of mercury. And what happens is that when it is that we inspire, right, what we want is a decrease in pressure so that we can increase volume. And once it is that we've decreased pressure, you can see where it is that the graph moves down like this. And then it approaches that 0 mark where it is that again, you're neither breathing in nor out. And then you want to do what? Increase that pressure so that you can decrease that volume and get that air out, and see it there. Intrapleural pressure, again, this graph really and truly should have started at -4. Some persons take it as a range between here, but -4 is the standard value. Again, you see that decrease, with that decrease in pressure, right? You have air moving in, inspiration, and you have that with expiration. And this graph is just showing how it is that air moves in. And again, same graph stuff, same concept, how it is that volume is going to be changing throughout. And right here is important. Transpulmonary pressure, where it is that we've taken the two graphs over time, and we know that this difference between the alveolar pressure and the pleural pressure will be equal to the transpulmonary pressure. Everybody enjoying themselves so far? Yes? No? Okay. Great. Now, this concept of compliance, very important. Very important. Right. So, I spoke to you guys earlier about elasticity. Elasticity is a measure of recoil. So, it's not how stretchy something is, it isn't. Compliance is a measure of stretch. That's what it is. So the opposite of elasticity is compliance. So if it is that you have something that is very loose, that means that it is compliant. If it is that you have something that's very tight, well, okay, that's going to be elastic. Fair enough. And again, we explained that that was one of the major factors that contributed to that negative intrapleural pressure. Now, I want you guys to understand something, even though it's not going to be for this class, but for other classes. You see, whenever it is that you guys make it to third year, fourth year, fifth year, and your clinical years, the understanding, when it is that you have to explain any form of pulmonary disorder, you must always come back to these terms of compliance, these terms of elasticity, these terms of partial pressure, because the explanation of every single pathology, most of the pathologies that you're going to learn and that people are going to have problems with as it relates to the respiratory system is going to lie in a difference in compliance as opposed to elasticity. And I'll give you an example. In the case of pulmonary fibrosis, right? In the case of pulmonary fibrosis, which is a restrictive pulmonary disorder, that is what it is that it's classified as. Pulmonary fibrosis, as well as sarcoidosis, can result in an increase in the elasticity of the lungs. So pulmonary fibrosis, as the best example, is where it is that you're going to have the laying down of scar tissue, replacing the parenchyma of the lungs. Now, your lungs are supposed to have a natural equal balance of compliance and elasticity, where it is that yes, the lungs want to recoil, but they have to be compliant enough to facilitate an increase in volume. With a case of pulmonary fibrosis, what you have happening is that the lungs become too elastic because fibrous scar tissue isn't as compliant or stretchy as healthy lung parenchyma. So that in that case, you would expect that that person would have no difficulty getting air outside of their lungs because the lungs are going to always going to want to be recoiled, right, or be recoiling, but they're going to have issues getting air into the lungs, right, which is why it's called a restrictive pulmonary disorder, because the lungs just aren't compliant anymore to facilitate any significant increase in volume. So those persons have a lot of difficulty with breathing. An example, and again, these are things that we're going to cover in other lectures, but it is that we get, because this is again just an introduction to the physiology, where I'm just throwing terms at you guys. Another example is emphysema. Emphysema is a COPD, right? Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. The issue with emphysema is at the level of the alveoli for the most part. Now, the alveoli have elastic tissue. They all have elastic tissue, but everything wears away eventually. So normally what would happen is that you have an enzyme called elastase. Elastase is that enzyme that is going to break down the elastic tissue and facilitate the reproduction of that elastic tissue. So under normal circumstances, that's what should happen. Because what should happen is that your elastase is going to be inhibited by what we call your alpha antitrypsin 1. And that is really just an inhibitory molecule that balances out the activity of elastase. So again, elastase is supposed to be breaking down elastic tissue. Alpha 1 antitrypsin or alpha antitrypsin 1 should be regulating the activity of elastase so that elastase just doesn't go into your lungs and just destroys all the elastic tissue. No, there are cases where alpha 1 antitrypsin, thank you, Owen. So there are cases where it is that that persons either have a deficiency where it is that they don't have any alpha 1 antitrypsin being produced, or it can actually just become induced, like in chronic smokers. And what happens is that your alveoli are just broken down and they become very patent. So there's no level of elasticity within them. And as a result, if it is that you just imagine one of the round bottom flasks that you guys would have done used in chemistry, that is literally how it is that your alveoli start looking. And essentially air just moves in and pretty much finds it very, very difficult to get out because there's no level of elasticity there. So the person, and how it is that I remember the difference between obstructive and restrictive pulmonary disorders is that in obstructive pulmonary disorders, they have difficulty getting air out. And I aligned the O in obstructive with the O in out, and that's how I remember it. If you guys have some other way of remembering it, sure. But the example you guys have of an obstructive pulmonary disorder would be emphysema, and that's the classic example. Must be tested on that, must know about your alpha 1 antitrypsin activity on elastase, and thereby the issue with its deficiency. And a classic example of your restrictive pulmonary disorder would most definitely be a pulmonary fibrosis. Everybody understands what I've said so far? You want me to go over it? You want me to do what? Yes? No? Okay. So we're going to be, for the next couple of classes, we're going to be going through a lot of topics that you need to understand. That's why it is that you need to understand these terms, right? Compliance and elasticity are two different things. Compliance is a measure of how stretchy something is. Elasticity is a measure of recoil. In explaining pathologies, you need to be able to always draw on your physiology. So you need to understand the pathophysiology first, and then understand how that is going to affect the physiology, and thereby explain the pathology. So, classic example of your restrictive pulmonary disorders, pulmonary fibrosis. What happens in pulmonary fibrosis? You have the laying down of fibrous scar tissue. The fibrous scar tissue replaces a healthy lung parenchyma. In that, your lung tissue becomes extremely elastic. It's no longer very compliant. And as a result, that person has difficulty getting air in, but has no problem getting air out. That person has no problem getting air out, but has problem getting air in. In a classic example of obstructive, that would be emphysema. And in emphysema, you have alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. In the classic cases, genetic deficiency of alpha-1 antitrypsin, which is supposed to be regulating the activity of elastase. If it is that you don't have alpha-1 antitrypsin, elastase gets to work, it destroys the elastic tissue that is going to be within your alveoli, and then as a result, you have very patent alveoli, just like a round bottom flask, and air moves in very, very, very easily, but there's no supportive elastic tissue to get air out. And again, we'll be going over this again in other classes for the physiology and the pathology, where it is that we give more and more examples, how it is that we're going to be able to tell the difference between emphysema, asthma, bronchitis, and all of those things. But I just wanted you guys to understand the application of compliance as opposed to elasticity. Everybody is good? Everybody? Okay, great. So here it is that I had discussed some of these. Again, we're going to go over them eventually. So pulmonary edema. Pulmonary edema actually affects, how can I put this? So we know that our alveoli are supposed to be lined by surfactant, and surfactant is responsible for keeping your airways pretty much patent, right? So, oh yes, so what Owen is saying here are things that we're going to cover more in pathology, where it is that the classic presentation is that they are pink puffers. Owen, you can explain that, but we don't need to go over that right now. Right. So, sorry. So these are the different factors. This is what I was getting into when it is I'm saying that you're going to have to use the concept of compliance and resistance to explain the different ones. Again, we went through fibrosis, we went through emphysema, and when we get deep into the pathology, we'll go through pulmonary edema, where it is that we have a buildup of fluid actually within the alveolar sacs, and that happens very often with infections. And as one can expect with pulmonary edema, if it is that you have a buildup of fluid within the alveolar sacs, that means that you've already decreased that blood gas barrier, because oxygen just then moves in, and it has to, the respiratory lining, right, or what they call the respiratory surface or the respiratory membrane is now thickened because of just fluid barring air from getting in close contact with the squamous cells of the alveoli, and therefore making that smooth transition through the basement membrane of the alveoli, through the basement membrane of the capillaries, right in through the endothelial layers of the capillaries. Right. So that's that. Are there questions? Yeah, so great. So surfactants. So this was something that we were supposed to talk about from the beginning as well. So you don't have to remember this first point. All you need to remember about surfactant is that it's lipid-based, right? As it relates to the structure. So it's lipid-based. Now, water is everywhere, right? If it is that you have an alveoli without surfactant, when it is that moistened air enters into your alveoli, water is going to line your alveoli. We know that water is attracted to water, and surfaces are attracted to their cells as well. So all of those hydrogen bonds, those van der Waals forces, all of those intermolecular forces and intramolecular forces, if it is that surfactant isn't present, is actually going to result in a collapse of the alveolar sacs, because the alveolar sacs always want to assume the smallest possible position. And if it is that you give them the privilege of having surface to surface contact, especially if it's lined by water, which it would be if no surfactant is there, you would have a thin film of water. That alveolus is going to actually collapse. So that is why we need surfactant production by our type 2 pneumocytes in our lungs. And though we may have type 1 pneumocytes, which are going to be the ones responsible for gaseous exchange, and we have our type 2, which are for the production of surfactant. This is very important. Surfactant is first produced around the 27th to the 28th week of intrauterine life. Remember the 28th. And this is why it is that I'm saying this. If it is that I divide this number by 4, right? I want to know how many months this is. I can calculate that that would be 7 months, right? And that's very important, because you should know that premature babies less than 7 months are going to be in problems. Because if it is that you have inadequate or no surfactant production, you're going to have a case of atelectasis, where it is that you have lung collapse, because you have no surfactant to actually keep your alveoli patent. So surfactant production begins at the 28th week, which is why premature babies of 7 months can live. There is a chance of them living because at least they have some form of surfactant produced. And surfactant production fully ends at about 34 weeks. So therefore that falls nicely in the range for the actual postnatal life. So if it is that you're younger than 7 months, meaning in intrauterine life, there's a very, very, very low chance of you living once it is that you come out, because you have no surfactant production. However, note that you can induce surfactant production, especially if it is that you have very little surfactant being produced. We can induce it, and even in pregnancy, we can give the persons the mother treatment to get surfactant production running. So surfactant essentially lowers surface tension, which is what we're talking about. If it is that we have just the alveolar surface exposed and you have water coming in, the surface would just collapse. It's just like when it is that you said that insects running on water. That's literally what would happen. And it prevents a rapid collapse of the alveolar sacs, atelectasis. Have to know this. And essentially, it increases the compliance of the lungs. And that makes sense that it increases the compliance of the lungs. Because if it's anything that keeps the airway patent, means that it keeps the airway compliant. So if surfactant keeps the airway patent, then it keeps the lungs compliant. And therefore, a reduction in surfactant decreases the compliance. And if you decrease the compliance, you increase the elasticity. And if you increase the elasticity, you get a lung collapse. One more clinical thing is, what do they call that again? Leave it alone, it's probably at the end. Oh no, it was about the lung collapse, where it is that you can have a collapse or atelectasis occurring if it is that you get a stab wound that actually pierces your parietal pleura and therefore leaves an open communication between, someone is sending something. Yeah, a pneumothorax, thank you. So that's an example where it is that you can get atelectasis. if you increase compliance, you decrease elasticity. Yes. So if it is that you increase compliance, then you actually decrease elasticity. So if it is that, something that is very compliant is very stretchy, right? And if it is that you think back to one of your first physics labs that you did, where it is that you had Hooke's law, where it is that your spring constant remains constant until it's overstretched. That's the point. So if it is that you have something that is extremely stretchy, then it means that it's not very elastic, because elasticity is a measure of recoil. Elasticity is a measure of tightness, and compliance is a measure of looseness. So surfactant increases compliance because it keeps the airway patent by lowering the surface tension, by lowering the chances of that collapse of the alveolar sacs, which is atelectasis, right? And if it is that it increases compliance, then it decreases elasticity because the alveoli are not going to collapse. And then as a result, if you decrease the elasticity, then you have a patent airway. That's pretty much it. And you decrease the chances of that occurring. And again, you need to know that it starts, the production begins at the 27th week and it ends at about the 34th week. On the case of the pneumothorax, you can get an induced pneumothorax, gunshot wound, stab wound, and what that leaves is an open communication between the outside, which is going to be atmospheric pressure, and your parietal pressure, right? Or your parietal volume. So what happens is that air will just rush through that opening there, and what that would result is atelectasis as a result of that pneumothorax. Because what happens is that you have the literal compression of your lungs, where it is that your lungs can no longer, it doesn't have much volume into which it can expand. So that pressure of air actually acting against the lungs as a result of that pneumothorax would result in atelectasis. Everybody gets that? Say yes, no, everybody's clear so far. Anything you want me to repeat or go over? All right, great. This slide, very unimportant somewhat, but it's things that you already know. The larger your alveolus, the lesser the chance of it collapsing, right? Because you're going to need sufficient surface tension to actually cause this large alveolus to collapse. As opposed to a smaller alveolus, you don't need that much greater of surface tension to get this to collapse. But these two, this is really just showing a point of relation, because as it is that you can see here is comparing the small alveolus with no surfactant, having that increased surface tension, as opposed to this with surfactant. And you can see where it is that this has a lesser tendency to collapse. So that's all highlighted here. Decreased tendency to collapse relative to this because of its larger size, and then this with surfactant. This is just some more clinical things that I added. So IRDS is infant respiratory distress syndrome, or it can be called hyaline membrane disorder. And that would be the case where it is that I spoke about surfactant, where it is that for example, you have the baby coming out, and the baby shows obvious signs of cyanosis, where it is that the baby is gasping for breath, and it's not as if the baby is crying or anything. You can detect that the child actually has infant respiratory distress syndrome. And as a result, you're going to need to act quickly, because this actually kills, right? Where it is that you're going to see if it is, and there are drugs that you can give, whereby you can have an emergency production of surfactant. Pulmonary edema, I spoke about that, and how it is that can affect respiration, in which it increases the thickness of the respiratory membrane. If it is that you have a buildup of fluid, then what's going to happen is that you increase the entire distance that air actually or oxygen has to diffuse across. And therefore, that person is also going to be very hypoxic, right? They're going to have very little accessible oxygen because they're going to have to wait much longer. I believe that the respiratory membrane is 0.5 microns thick, if my memory serves me right. And this pulmonary edema will thicken that extensively. Atelectasis, another important term we need to be aware of. Pulmonary fibrosis, I brought that up. Remember, there are certain drugs. You have drug-induced pulmonary fibrosis like bleomycin. Those drugs can result in if it is that you have chronic use. We spoke about emphysema. We will speak about bronchitis and asthma as it is that we go along. And that's pretty much it, guys. Do you guys have any questions? Most of it is that we get the questions out the way I have a notice to make before you guys leave. My youths are blessed up. Anyways, so one thing. So since it is that we're at the end of this demo, yes, thank you. So great. So since it